If you want this podcast free of ads, follow us now on patreon.com/David McWilliams. To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is podcast time. Today, I want to talk to you about something that I think would profoundly, for the better, change this city, which is relocating the port out of Dublin into somewhere else. The problem with Dublin Port is it's in the wrong place. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
That sounds good to me.
How are you, Ed?
I'm great. I am super duper. You're over your COVID.
Do you know I had COVID last week?
I know you had COVID.
I had Mickey Mouse COVID. Pretend COVID.
Well, see, you were vaccinated up the yin-yang. So.
I know, I've been so vaccinated. I can safely say to the listeners of Dave McWilliams' podcast, if you get the COVID now, it was about a day of snifflies, a little bit of flu-y one day.
He was a bit cranky, in fairness.
I was very cranky. I'm very cranky last weekend, and all is good. But I have been strolling, John, because of over the COVID. I've been doing my routine down to the 40-foot across Dunleary Pier, and I was on Dunleary Pier this morning, okay, on the East Pier, the swanky pier, and I saw...
In your dry robe?
Not in my dry robe, John. Could you imagine me in dry robe? Could you imagine? I don't do the swimming thing. Yes. I only swim in continental waters, okay? Enough of this carry on. Although her nibs is in every day.
So I believe.
Shan is in all the time.
It's the whole new thing.
It's a whole new thing. If I hear another person say it's good for my mind, give me a break. Anyway, when I was down on the pier, there's a plaque, John, to Samuel Beckett on the pier. And the reason I want to talk to you about
is there?
Beckett. Yes.
Whereabouts?
Right. On the pier, it's a East Pier. Yeah. Past the bandstand.
Yeah.
You go to the elbow.
Yeah.
Right? Just beyond the elbow, there's a small little wind turbine. And underneath that is a plaque to Beckett. And it's the quote from Krapp's last tape.
Oh,
and
Jesus.
The quote is, I know, John went to Beckett, and he didn't like, we'll talk about that in a second, but the quote is, great granite rocks, the foam flying up in the light of the lighthouse, and the wind gauge spinning like a propeller. Clear to me at last that the dark I have always struggled to keep under is in reality my most... And it stops. That's a typical Beckett, right?
It's like the money's in the...
Yeah. Krapp's last tape, John.
There was...
You went to this.
I saw a live performance of that, and I have to say it was possibly the worst night of my life. I think was I 15 or 16, and my eldest brother Tony brought
John's older brother now is very great man for the books. Great man
for the books, yeah. And he brought myself and my other brother in, and it was a big deal because it was the three of us, three brothers, going for our pints together, you know, and we were just young fellas. Yeah. So Tony says, "Yeah, we'll go for a pint, and I'll take you to Beckett." It was like, Jesus, it was a double bill as well. It was Krapp's last tapes and Rockabye.
Okay, well, poor old John, we're not.
And I have a thing about Beckett ever since.
Well, listen, first of all, Beckett born on Good Friday, 1906. Right. So we're celebrating Beckett, but the reason I'm interested in Krapp's last tape, the quote, right? So Krapp's last tape is all about a man having an epiphany. And the tape, as he keeps going back, you might remember, this is what did your head in. And now lad keeps going back to the tapes of his voice at various different stages.
Yes.
And it's a sort of meditation on generations and all that sort of stuff, right? And
I never knew that.
That's what it's all about, and how we age. We age, and do we as a person, do we change? Like, am I the same person now that I was when I was 30 or I was when I was 20 or 15? And how does life affect us? So it's, it's a meditation on life, right? But John, what's fascinating for me is the fact that Beckett was writing all about Dunleary all the time, right?
Right.
Okay, right.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah. This is another Beckett quote from Dunleary. By the way, this is a very, very narcissistic podcast. It's about our hometown. Beckett, this is a quote from Serena 2, which is a poem, right? A route, this is about looking down on Dunleary from the quarry in Dalkey, right? The
quarry, place we know very well.
Well, as you said about the pier, what was that?
Oh yeah, the reason why there's a quarry in Killiney is they took all the granite from that quarry, that's why it's a quarry, to build a pier down here. But of course, they created this lovely, perfect venue for us to go drinking in our teens.
Yeah, it was perfect place for field drinking. Very picturesque, actually. Yes, yeah. Very picturesque. But the reason we're talking, by the way, about Dunleary Pier and about Beckett and Krapp's last tape is, in a minute, we're going to be talking about cathedral thinking. And the idea behind cathedral thinking is you build infrastructure, not to last decades, but to last centuries. Dún Laoghaire Pier was built in between the 1830s through to the 1850s. Big, big project. And it was built to last centuries, and it has done.
Yeah.
But Beckett, talking about Dún Laoghaire, listen, this is a lovely description of Dún Laoghaire. He talks about a route of tracks and streams fleeing to the sea, a kindergarten of steeples, and then the harbour, like a woman making to cover her breasts. Because it is, if you imagine, it's that sort of movement, you know? And a kindergarten of steeples.
Yes,
right?
That's
but
lovely.
It is fascinating. But the Krapp's last tape thing is all about epiphanies. And the quote that I just gave you, this great granite rocks, the one that's actually written on Dún Laoghaire Pier, is about an epiphany that he actually had in his 30s. So in Krapp's last tape, it's a guy in his late 30s. He's listening to his voice from the late 30s, but he's in his late 60s. But it's actually an epiphany that he actually had, that he decided he was really worried about his work. And unlike, for example, he decided then, right, this epiphany, which he signalled to have had on Dún Laoghaire Pier, right? Which is amazing, right?
Yeah.
That's when he decided to strip back his work. So he was really confused. So in the way that Joyce used to add bits, Joyce could never stop writing.
Right.
To add bits and bits and more stories and more stories and more stories. And Beckett thought, no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract. I'm going to get right down. And the whole reason that so much of Beckett's difficult is his whole idea was he was going to write plays where the language was kind of secondary in the sense that he wanted to give meaning beyond language. So very, very peculiar character. Right?
Yeah, all highfalutin stuff.
Very highfalutin stuff for an economics podcast. Okay, but you don't say we don't go eclectic. But my point was, as I was walking on Dún Laoghaire Pier, and I was walking past the 40-foot as well, a place where Beckett learned how to swim. He writes about that. His dad used to take him to swim all the time, the 40-foot. He writes about that a lot. And I was on Dún Laoghaire Pier, I was thinking, these guys built something to last. These guys weren't putting up infrastructures little by little, jerry building things. They were actually saying, we're going to build something monumental that is going to take us a long time, but it's going to be there for centuries. This is the idea of cathedral thinking. And this week I want to talk about Dublin Port and moving Dublin Port as an example, John, of cathedral thinking. Because Dublin Port is one, and we've done this before. Remember you went to Oslo and you spoke to the Norwegians about moving their port. Yeah. This is what cities do. They take control of their environment and they say, what do we want this to look like? Not in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time, but in 100 years' time or 200 years' time. And building cities takes a long, long time. Yeah. And that's why, and the idea of cathedral thinking comes from this notion, John, and we've talked about it before, that the people who built, let's say, Cologne Cathedral or Notre Dame, right? We spoke about it even a couple of weeks ago, right? Those people built buildings that they knew they would never see when they were completed, but they built for future generations, right? And I was always intrigued by the notion of this good ancestor, this idea.
Yes, yeah.
So Jonas Salk, who was the man who invented the vaccine for polio, right? So imagine this. This is a disease that was killing humans for thousands of years, right? And this guy...
And maiming humans.
Yeah, and horrible. And this guy spent years and years and years researching, figuring it out. He was a medic, American medic, and he came up with the vaccine for polio, which saved millions of people, not just their lives, but as you said, it made enormous difference to the way people lived. Yeah, right?
Yeah.
But he gave it away for free, right? He actually gave everything away for free. And he was asked, why do you do this? Why did you not patent it? And he said, because I want to be a good ancestor. I want to leave the world in a better place than I found it, which is an extraordinary thing. But he was a big partier as well, Jonas Salk.
Was he?
Went off with Picasso's missus.
Did he?
He did. And Picasso was a bit of a swordsman in his day, and Salk went off with his missus.
But tell me this, though. Who was he working for when he
was working,
came up with the vaccine?
I don't know what university he was working for or what laboratory. I'm not too sure.
Yeah.
But I know that he gave it away.
See, because I wonder, is it a thing now where, how many people would have the opportunity to say, there you go, I've done all this work, I've come up with this cure for whatever and
Mickey Mouse
for free, because now everything is so commercialized and so much investment that people want their money back.
They want their money back. Well, that's the whole thing of pharma, isn't it? That's why it's called big pharma, because so many things don't work. and you have to invest enormous amounts of research to get one drug. And that's why they demand having patents. And then that's why you have all this tug of war between generic drugs and patented drugs and all that sort of stuff. You know, it's a fascinating area. For example, in Croatia, right? The woman who lives beside us in Croatia, right, buys the drugs for Šibenik, the area in the hospital.
Right.
And they all buy generic drugs.
Yeah.
They don't buy any patented drugs. They can't afford them.
But isn't it amazing? It feels like, I could be wrong here, and I'm just putting it out there, that's
always worrying when John, this is what he's like in the pub, right? This is what he's like in a bar. He said, Mac, I'm just putting it out there.
2 more pints, please.
2 more pints.
But that way of thinking, that kind of long-term thinking and doing something for the greater good, seems to be lacking that kind of approach.
You're right. So we're going to talk about how do you think long-term in an endemic short-term world.
Yeah.
Thinking long-term in the TikTok age. That is the title of our podcast, John. And you and Beckett would have been jealous of that, right? Okay. Long-term thinking in the TikTok age. But
he wouldn't have finished that sentence.
long-term thinking in the and then he'd put it on a tape and force you to go and watch it. Anyway, I want to talk about Dublin Port. Dublin Port should, I believe, be moved, right? Imagine the era of putting ports at the mouth of rivers was a function of a time when rivers were the trading superhighways of countries.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's why you get all these ports at the mouth of big rivers, because we use the rivers to get goods from the inland.
Sure.
The Liffey is many things, but a trading superhighway, it is not.
Yeah.
I mean, why do we have a port at the mouth of the Liffey? I don't know. Because it's a legacy issue that we had when the Vikings were hanging around.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
Well, it was actually used. My mother talks about that and how they brought up, during the Second World War in particular, they brought up turf and they brought up hay for the horses from the country through the canals, but they all arrived.
But we're not doing that anymore.
Yes.
Right? Dublin Port has already moved 3 times. It was Wood Quay. People who are into Viking history and archaeology will know it was then the Customs House.
Yeah.
And then it moved further down. So it's already, the idea of moving the port is something that Dubliners have been doing for generations. But the idea here, the real opportunity here, John, is the fact that there are 270 hectares of prime land in the port. If you move the port...
That's a huge...
It's massive.
event.
It's 1/3 the size of Phoenix Park, which is the largest urban park in Europe. So it's enormous. If you look at the footprint of the port, you're thinking Rathmines, Ranelagh, Harold's Cross put together. So it's a whole new suburb.
Yeah.
It's a whole new...
Yeah.
I mean, we could build, and I'm going to go talk to you about it, you could build a new waterfront city, and a whole new city. The reason this is important is because if we don't build at some level of density, when we talk about Jane Jacobs, some sort of idea of a denser city, what we will do is we will just build out in Ireland.
Yeah.
And we'll have more and more and more pollution, more and more commuting.
Out into the green spaces.
Out into the green spaces, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, remember we were talking to John Byrne Murdoch the other day, and he was saying that the denser the urban environment, the more efficient everything is. Transport, hospitals, schools.
Which makes
everything.
perfect sense.
Makes complete sense, right? And if the port doesn't have to be there, why is it there? It's there because we just can't be bothered thinking up a new idea. The new idea, even the Dublin Port Company themselves have talked about moving the port to either Breamore, which is just North Dublin, or Arklow, right?
Yeah.
Or you can even go further. There's Greenore up in Louth, there's Rosslare, there's Waterford, there's all these places you could actually move it, right? But the idea is that the land which is on Dublin Port is so much more valuable than the land on a greenfield site for a new port that would be somewhere else. And the whole idea here is to get our head around the notion that people actually like to live beside the sea. I mean, Dublin, it's amazing.
Well, of course,
People want to live beside it. Dublin has done something amazing. It's a maritime capital that has turned its back on the sea. Unless you're out in the suburbs, out here in Dunleary or around Sutton, around on the north side, you've no sense of the sea in Dublin, right? And when you get into the city of Dublin, it's as if your gaze is blocked just there at the O2 or the O3 or whatever it's called, you know, the Point Depot, right?
Yeah.
As if your gaze is blocked. There's no sense of us being on the water. Now, you went to Oslo.
Interesting you should say that about turning your back on the sea, because the main part of Oslo back in the 80s was the main port. It was called Björvika. And they went through all this kind of soul searching and stuff, and they decided that they would move the port only a mile or two down the fjord. And they turn this whole area, regenerate the whole thing. You were talking about turning your back on the city. They reorientated the city from east to west, which changed not only the physical structure of the city, but also the mind of the city and the perception of the people. And I spoke with one of the city developers, Anne Beat Hovland, and she describes how they went about it, why they went about it, and she makes some really interesting points about the kind of democratic process, but also that long-termism and cathedral thinking. Have a listen. This, 20 years ago, Anne, was a port full of container ships, warehouses and all that goes with that kind of environment. And it's completely changed now.
Yeah, it's a total transformation. It's not like some parts, some waterfront or harbour developments that have all warehouses they could keep. All of these are taken down. So it's an absolutely total transformation. So 20 years, there's still things to be done. But now it's become, I think, what many people dreamt of. It's a very vibrant city.
What kind of impact has the new port had on the city of Oslo as a whole?
Well, the city, I think the waterfront development has changed the city a lot. And of course, there's more space and more use of the waterfront. People have kind of discovered that they actually have a seafront behind all these barriers. And I remember, just where we are now, people said nobody will go that far, walk that far, because people, in their minds, it was a very long distance. It's not a physical distance, but it's a mental distance. Okay. So when they cracked the code, nobody would even mention that today because it's not far. So it has had a big impact, I think, on how the perception about ourselves, the perception of a city, how to develop a city, because it's such a big transformation in Norway. It reminded us building a city takes 100 years. You shouldn't build anything that wouldn't last for a long, long time. It's about investments. It's about, that's what they did cathedral thinking in the old days, yes. Right? Yeah. So building a city is a cathedral thinking thing. It's not a short-termism thing. You have to think long-term. So it really conceptually challenged our perception of both place and time. Developing a city is a democratic thing. Nobody should be left alone. I think to build a city, you have to have discussions. It's important because it's part of our democracy to discuss what kind of city do we want.
And when I was there, by the way, Mac, the place is just gorgeous.
I've been there. It's beautiful.
Yeah. And they've the new Opera House and the Munch Museum. Absolutely amazing. But listen.
We could have a Beckett Museum there just for you, John.
Let's have a talk about Dublin Port after this.
Okay. So basically, right now, Dublin Port is having a public consultation period where people can actually give their opinions. And the opinion we would like to give is that, in fact, the entire thing should be moved because Dublin Port is amazing. And this is a quote from Dublin Port themselves, right? So what they're planning to do now, which is redevelop the port, in their own report, this is a quote, they said, Dublin Port will reach its maximum throughput of capacity sometime between 2030 and 2040. This means additional port capacity will be needed elsewhere on the east coast of Ireland to cater for the growth which Dublin Port will not be able to accommodate once this point has been reached. So they've already admitted that Dublin Port will reach capacity in 10 years' time.
Right.
Like 2040 is only 17 years hence. Saipan was 21 years ago and we're still going on about it. Do you know what I mean?
But you are.
do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
So
yeah, it's
even
nothing.
Dublin Port have admitted.
My kids have grown up in the blink of an eye.
Exactly.
My youngest is 17.
Exactly. Yeah. And in that lifetime again, we'll be at 2040, where they have said everything that we're doing now in Dublin into the port will reach capacity by then, and we'll have to get a new port anyway somewhere in the East Coast.
Yeah.
So why not say, whoa, hold on a second, move everything now, as the Norwegians have done, as the Dutch have done, as the Singaporeans have done, as all countries, or so many countries have done this. And the interesting thing is The port at the moment is run obviously by a very efficient company, Dublin Port. So it's nothing against them.
Yeah.
They're obviously very good management. It does about 36 million tons of cargo. It's about 7,000 ships coming and going per annum. So it's a very busy port.
Yeah.
So they can run a port.
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of shifting the location. And there are options. But of course, what they've said is, well, we can't do this because A, Ireland isn't good at mega projects, which is kind of fair enough, right? We do accept that. But that's no reason not to do it. Just because we have overruns on previous projects doesn't mean that you actually don't do it.
Yeah.
Number two, we've already admitted that Dublin Port will be a capacity. But number three, much more like the Norwegians, it changes the city.
Yes.
This is what city developers do. When you look at all the beautiful buildings in Dublin, for example, they were all built in this extraordinary period from about 1750 to about 1790. Dublin was reconceived. The Wide Streets Commission in the Victorian age created boulevards in Dublin that have again stood the test of time. This is what you do. You reimagine the city. This is what the Norwegians have done. This is exactly what any city that has a sense of pride about itself does.
And what Anne was saying there, like in Oslo, they started it 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, and they're still
still building it.
Yeah, it's still a work in progress.
But it's absolutely beautiful. I mean, the thing is, it changed the city. So the Dublin Port guys have said, look, we're going to reach capacity, but Ireland's very, very bad at this. I know anyway, it's going to be extremely expensive. So what they've said is if you wanted to move it to Arklow, for example, this is one they're saying it would cost 8.3 billion euros.
Right.
The entire project, moving it, shifting all the machinery that's already in the port, new infrastructure, new port, all that stuff.
So that's just a little more than half of the surplus budget we had last year.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's like the windfall from Google.
Yes.
It's not a huge amount. But I have done some back of the envelope calculations.
Oh, good man.
Now, this is the interesting thing, right? Ireland needs urban housing. We know that.
Yeah.
There is the potential. There is a special development zone in Poolbeg, right?
Yeah.
If you take exactly the same density that has been already announced in Poolbeg and already underwritten in Poolbeg, and you do it in Dublin Port, you'll get something the following, right? The Poolbeg density is 238 units per hectare. Dublin Port is 270 hectares, okay? So if you superimpose the plan on the port, you would create 61,880 new units in this new city. That's accommodating about 100,000 people at 1 or 2 people per unit. Okay, that's what we decide to go, right? So it's 100,000 people.
Is that really dense?
No. That would be on a par with normal. So a lot of people say, "Oh my God, they're going to build Manhattan on the."
Yeah.
A lot of this is actually Norwegian density we're talking about.
Right. Okay.
So what nobody's saying is, people say, "Oh, you're going to build Dubai on the Docklands." No, we're going to build a new city which will accommodate people and will have perfectly modern infrastructure. That's the key.
Yes.
And now think about this. So imagine it costs 8.3 billion. You thought, okay, how much does the land, the site value of every unit have to be to make back 8.3 billion, to pay for itself? This is the key. I have calculated, John, that every site unit from this would need to be 134,000 euros per site, right? Now, what that means is that, so you multiply, just to get it in your head, right? 134,000 multiplied by 238 units multiplied by 260 hectares. That gives you the figure, right? Site values at that are a bargain. 135 grand is a bargain in Dublin for a site value. Dublin site values are 3 or 4 times that.
Right, yeah,
so you could
there
provide social housing cheaper than anyone else on that site. You would have no people, for example, talking to you about YIMBYism or NIMBYism because there's no one there, right? You could build 60,000 units for 100,000 people at half the price of developments that are being developed in Dublin at the moment. And at that price, you could pay for the entire move of the port, the 8.3 billion, self-financing.
Yes.
Self-financing, the whole thing.
Yeah.
So it could be done.
And also you'd have a whole new amenity of the whole waterfront of Dublin.
The whole waterfront of Dublin completely changed. And as they did in Norway, you'd reorientate the city to the sea, right? Dublin faces the M50 when it could face the sea, right? What other maritime city closes off its access to its single biggest resource and amenity, which is the sea? Which we can go back to Beckett. This is what we're getting. Beckett swimming, talking about the seas crashing down, the epiphanies. Dublin is a seaside town.
Yeah.
And yet we have blocked it off. We have a housing crisis. And yet we don't entertain the single most obvious prime real estate in the country, which is owned by us. Nobody else owns it. The state owns it. We are the shareholders of Dublin. We could move Dublin Port. And if you wanted to self-finance that move, you could do that by superimposing the new density of Poolbeg onto this new site. 135 grand per site cost is a bargain. And at that price, you've paid for everything. I mean, it's I wouldn't say it's a no-brainer, because obviously these are huge projects. But we go back to the cathedral thinking. Unless we think about future generations, unless we think about building infrastructure for people who have yet to be born. The thing about people who are yet to be born is they have no voice. So somebody has to speak for them. We spoke about John Gray a couple of weeks ago on the podcast.
Yeah.
John Gray, the man who created the water infrastructure that is still bringing fresh water to Dubliners, right? Over-engineer the project, he said. Build more capacity than you have to. At the moment, we have an opportunity to completely change the city and completely change the east coast of Ireland and completely reorientate the industrial model of Ireland. And all it demands is somebody thinking not 1 decade into the future, not 2 decades into the future, but thinking about 200 years into the future. That's how you build cities.